There are moments in life when we face storms that shake us to our core. It could be a personal loss, an unexpected setback, a health crisis, or a challenge in our relationships. These storms come without warning, and in their wake, they leave us feeling powerless, afraid, and uncertain. We look around for answers, for comfort, for direction. But in those moments of darkness, there is one thing we must hold on to, and that is trust. Trust in God. Trust that no matter how fierce the storm is, God is with us and He will see us through. You see, trust is not just something we give when things are easy. It's easy to trust God when everything is going well. When the sun is shining, when the bills are paid, when everyone is healthy and happy, it's easy to say, I trust God. But real trust, the kind of trust that changes your life, that pulls you through the hardest moments, is the trust you have when you can't see the way forward, when the wind is howling and the waves are crashing, when everything feels like it's falling apart. It's in those moments that trust becomes not just a word, but a lifeline. Now, I want you to think about the story in the Bible where the disciples are on a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee. The storm comes up, suddenly winds howling, waves crashing over the sides of the boat, and the disciples are terrified. They are seasoned fishermen, men who have sailed this sea many times, but in the face of this storm, they are overwhelmed. And where is Jesus? He's sleeping. Can you believe it? While the storm rages, Jesus is asleep, peaceful in the midst of chaos. The disciples wake him up desperate. Lord, don't you care if we drown? And what does he do? He gets up, rebukes the wind, and calms the storm. He says to them, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Now I want you to listen closely to that question. Do you still have no faith? Because in those moments when the storm rages, when fear grips us, God is asking us the same thing. Why are you afraid? Do you still not trust me? It's not that God doesn't understand our fear. He knows how human we are. He knows how the storms of life can feel overwhelming. But He also knows that fear and faith cannot coexist. When we choose to trust, we are choosing to let go of fear and take hold of something greater, the assurance that no matter what we face, God is bigger. Trusting God in the storm doesn't mean that the storm will go away immediately. It doesn't mean that all your problems will suddenly vanish or that everything will fall into place the way you want it. Trusting God in the storm means believing that He is present, even when you can't see Him. It means knowing that He is working, even when things don't look like they're changing. It means accepting that there is a purpose, even in the pain, even in the struggle. It's not easy, but it's necessary if you want to survive the storm. We have to understand that storms are part of life. They are inevitable. The Bible doesn't promise that we won't face trouble. In fact, it promises the opposite. Jesus said in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. The storms are coming, no matter what. But here's the difference when we trust God in the storm. We're not facing it alone. We're not fighting it in our own strength. We're not trying to figure it out by ourselves. We are trusting in the one who has already overcome the world. And when we do that, we are given peace that doesn't make sense, a peace that surpasses all understanding, as the Apostle Paul writes in Philippians 4:7. That peace is not the absence of trouble. It's not the end of the storm. It's the assurance that, though the storm may rage, God is still in control. He is still on the throne. He is still holding us in His hands. And when you can hold on to that truth, you can stand firm, even in the fiercest storm. But let's be real for a moment. Trusting God when everything is falling apart isn't always easy. Sometimes we're so focused on the waves, so overwhelmed by the situation, that we forget to look at the one who holds the power to calm the storm. We're like Peter, who, when he stepped out of the boat to walk toward Jesus on the water, started off strong. He was walking on water. Can you imagine that? But then the wind picked up and he took his eyes off Jesus. He began to sink. Why? Because he allowed fear to take his focus off the one who had called him. It wasn't the storm that caused Peter to sink, it was his lack of trust. How many times have we done the same thing? How many times have we let the storms of life distract us, pull our focus away from God, and cause us to doubt His presence? How many times have we said, God, I don't know if I can do this? Instead of saying, God, I trust that you will do this through me. When we take our eyes off God, that's when the fear takes over. That's when the doubt creeps in. But if we can keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, even in the middle of the storm, we can walk on water too. Trusting God in the storm also requires patience. We live in a world where we want everything fast, quick, and immediate. But sometimes God's timing is different from ours. Sometimes we have to wait. We have to wait for the storm to pass, or we have to wait for God to reveal his purpose in the storm. And while we're waiting, we're still trusting. We're trusting that he's working in us, refining us, preparing us for what's ahead. And let me tell you something, there's always something ahead. God is never done with us. He is always shaping us, molding us, making us into the people he's called us to be. But that process isn't always comfortable. It's painful. It's hard. But if we trust him, even when we can't see the end, we will come out stronger, wiser, and more aligned with his will for our lives. Sometimes, the storm is God's way of getting our attention. He allows the storm to shake us up, to remind us that we're not in control. We may think we have everything figured out, but the storm humbles us. It reminds us that we need God. We need his guidance, his wisdom, his strength. The storm is a way for God to teach us, to refine our character, to stretch our faith. And if we allow him to do his work, we come out of the storm better than we went in. But here's the thing. Even when the storm feels unbearable, even when you feel like you're drowning in your circumstances, remember this God is with you. He's right there in the boat with you. You are not alone. He has not forgotten you. And no matter how high the waves are, no matter how strong the winds may blow, he is able to calm the storm. He is able to bring peace in the midst of chaos. You may not see it now, but he is working. He is moving. And he is faithful. So when the storms come, and they will come, don't panic. Don't give in to fear. Trust in God. Trust that he is bigger than your storm, that he is greater than your circumstances, that he is faithful, even when you can't see the way forward. Trust that he is with you, and he will bring you through. The storm will not last forever. The rain will stop. The wind will calm. And you will stand stronger and more confident in your faith, knowing that through it all you have trusted God in the storm. There are moments in life when everything feels overwhelming. The storms come crashing down, uninvited and fierce. They arrive when we least expect them, and they bring with them a level of uncertainty, fear, and pain that is hard to comprehend. It might be a personal loss, a sudden diagnosis, a financial collapse, a relationship that's falling apart, or a sudden change in the direction of our lives. The storm doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. And in those moments when you're caught in the heart of it all, the one thing you have to decide is whether or not you will trust God. Trusting God in the storm is different from trusting him when everything is calm. In the calm, life is predictable, things are stable, and it's easy to talk about faith. But when life takes a sudden, unpredictable turn, when everything you thought you knew seems to unravel, that's when the rubber meets the road. That's when your faith is really tested. In those moments, it's easy to look at the storm around you and feel lost, desperate, and completely powerless. And yet, those are the exact moments when your trust in God is needed most. Faith in God is not something that is meant to be reserved for when things are easy. It's not something that only kicks in when the sun is shining and everything is going according to plan. Trusting God during the good times is important. It's a sign of gratitude, a recognition of his blessings. But real trust, the kind that anchors your soul and keeps you steady through the most turbulent of times, is developed in the storms of life. It's in the storm that trust is refined, deepened, and made stronger. It's easy to say you trust God when everything is going smoothly, but the true test of your faith comes when the winds howl, the waves rise, and you feel like you're about to be consumed by the storm. Trusting God in the storm is not simply about waiting for it to pass, but about choosing to believe that God is in control, even when you can't see the way forward. It's about having the courage to hold on to his promises, even when everything around you feels chaotic and uncertain. It's about remembering that He has been faithful in the past and trusting that He will remain faithful in the present, even when you don't understand how things are going to turn out. One of the most profound truths about storms in life is that they are inevitable. No one is exempt from them. The Bible doesn't promise us a life without hardship or suffering. In fact, it makes it clear that we will face challenges. In John 16:33, Jesus says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." That verse is powerful because it acknowledges the reality of our struggles, but also offers us hope. Jesus doesn't promise a life free of storms, but He does promise that He has already overcome them. His victory over the world means that no matter how severe the storm may be, we are never facing it alone. When we go through storms, there are two responses we can choose. We can either allow the storm to overwhelm us, or we can choose to trust God in the midst of it. But what does it actually mean to trust God in a storm? It doesn't mean that we won't feel the weight of the storm. It doesn't mean that we won't experience pain, confusion, or frustration. Trusting God in the storm means that we choose to believe that God is with us, even when we can't feel His presence. It means that we recognize that the storm doesn't define us and it doesn't control us. It's not the storm itself that has power over us, it's our response to the storm that determines the outcome. There's a story in the Bible that beautifully illustrates what it means to trust God in the storm. It's the story of the disciples in the boat during the storm, found in the Gospel of Mark. The disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee when suddenly a fierce storm comes up. The winds are howling, the waves are crashing over the boat, and the disciples are terrified. They are seasoned fishermen, men who have spent their lives on the water, but this storm is unlike any they've encountered before. In the midst of their fear, they look around and realize that Jesus is asleep in the boat. In their panic, they wake Him up and ask, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus gets up, rebukes the wind, and calms the storm with just a word. Then He turns to the disciples and asks, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith at first glance?" This might seem like a harsh rebuke. The disciples were genuinely scared, and Jesus was sleeping through the storm. But what Jesus was really addressing wasn't their fear, it was their lack of faith. In that moment, Jesus was showing them that no matter how severe the storm, they could trust Him to calm it. He was teaching them that even in the most terrifying of circumstances, He was still in control. The key point here is that Jesus was in the boat with them. And that is the crux of what it means to trust God in the storm. It's not that the storm won't come. It's not that the wind won't blow or the waves won't crash. It's that in the midst of it all, God is present with us. And because He is with us, we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to panic. The storm may be fierce, but our God is bigger. To trust God in the storm means to hold on to the truth that God is always with us, and He is always working, even when we can't see it. It's choosing to believe that He has a plan and purpose, even when our circumstances don't make sense. It's about recognizing that our perspective is limited, but God's is infinite. We may not understand why the storm is happening or what it's leading to, but we trust that God is in control, and He is always working for our good. But trusting God in the storm is not something that happens automatically. It's not something we just wake up and do when life hits us with a crisis. Trusting God in the storm is a choice that requires action, discipline, and a deep personal relationship with God. It's something that is cultivated over time through daily moments of prayer, worship, and surrender. It's developed as we look back at the times when God has been faithful in our past and use those moments as reminders of His goodness and power. It's trusting Him even when we can't see the way forward. Real trust in God is not just about acknowledging His power, but about surrendering our own control. It's about saying, "God, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I trust You when you're in the midst of a storm." That's often the hardest thing to do. Our natural response is to try to fix things ourselves, to take control of the situation, to figure out a way to make everything right. But trusting God means letting go of our need to control the outcome. It means saying, God, I trust you with this, and I trust that you will work all things together for my good, according to your will. The Bible tells us that the righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. Psalm 34:19. That's the promise we hold on to in the storm. The storm may seem endless, but God has promised that he will deliver us. His ways may not be our ways, and his timing may not be our timing, but he is faithful to keep his promises. And even when the storm is still raging, we can trust that God is already at work, shaping us, refining us, and preparing us for what is to come. Trusting God in the storm doesn't mean that we'll always understand why things happen the way they do. It doesn't mean that the pain will immediately disappear or that everything will be fixed right away. What it does mean is that we can rest in the assurance that God is with us. He is our anchor in the storm, our rock when everything else is shaking. And because of that, we can stand firm, knowing that the storm may come, but it will not have the final say. The storm will pass, but our trust in God remains, and that trust is what will see us through to the other side. When the storm hits, we have a choice. We can either let the storm consume us, or we can choose to trust God in the midst of it. And when we choose to trust him, we find peace that surpasses all understanding, even in the fiercest of storms. Trusting God in the storm is not just about waiting for the storm to end, it's about believing that he is with us and he is working in us, even when we can't see it. It's about resting in the truth that we are never alone, and that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn is coming. And when the storm finally calms, we will be stronger, deeper, and more rooted in our faith than before. Fear and faith are two forces that cannot coexist. At first glance, it may seem like these two emotions can exist simultaneously in our lives. After all, we are human, and our experiences often stir up both fear and faith in different ways. But when we look deeper, we begin to realize that fear, when allowed to take root in our hearts, actively undermines the very foundation of faith. Faith is rooted in trust, in belief in God's goodness, his sovereignty, and his promises. Fear, on the other hand, is rooted in doubt, in the belief that the worst is yet to come, that we are powerless, or that we are alone. These two cannot thrive together, because where fear dominates, faith diminishes. And where faith thrives, fear has no place to take hold. Fear is a natural human response. It's a feeling that protects us in dangerous situations, helping us avoid harm. But fear, when allowed to grow unchecked, can be crippling. It can stop us from stepping into new opportunities, challenge our sense of worth, and distort the way we see the world. In the Bible, we are frequently warned not to fear. From Genesis to Revelation, fear is treated not just as an emotion, but as a spiritual obstacle. Time and time again, God tells his people, do not fear. In Isaiah 41:10, God says, so do not fear, for I am with you, do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. The command to not fear is not because fear is a sin in and of itself, it's a human response that we all feel. But fear, when it becomes the lens through which we view our circumstances, can become a sin. It takes our eyes off God and puts them on our problems. It magnifies the size of the storm and diminishes the power of the one who controls it. Fear distorts our thinking and keeps us from experiencing the fullness of God's peace and provision. On the other hand, faith is the complete opposite. Faith allows us to trust in something beyond our circumstances, something beyond what we can see with our eyes or understand with our minds. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, Hebrews 11:1. Faith is believing in God's promises, his goodness, his love, and his power to work all things together for our good, Romans 8:28. Faith gives us the courage to step into the unknown, to face challenges, and to keep moving forward, even when the way forward isn't clear. It is an unwavering belief that no matter what happens, God is in control, and he will never leave us or forsake us. The tension between fear and faith often becomes most apparent when we are faced with uncertainty or crisis. When everything is calm and life is running smoothly, it's easy to talk about faith. We can quote scriptures about God's goodness and we can say, I trust God. But when the storm hits, when things take a turn we didn't expect, fear creeps in. The unknowns are terrifying. The what-ifs start to play on repeat in our minds, and suddenly faith feels distant. In those moments, the challenge becomes clear: do we trust God, or do we let fear control us? There's a powerful story in the Bible that illustrates this very conflict when Peter steps out of the boat to walk toward Jesus on the water. In Matthew 14:22-33, after Jesus has fed the 5,000, he sends his disciples ahead of him in a boat while he goes up on a mountain to pray. Later that night, a storm hits, and the disciples are struggling to row the boat in the rough waters. As they look out across the water, they see something they can't explain: Jesus walking toward them on the water. Naturally, they are terrified and think it's a ghost. But Jesus immediately says to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." At that moment, Peter, in a bold act of faith, says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says simply, "Come." So Peter steps out of the boat and begins walking on the water toward Jesus. But as soon as he notices the wind, as soon as fear enters his heart, he begins to sink. He cries out, "Lord, save me," and Jesus immediately reaches out his hand, catches him, and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This story is a powerful example of the interplay between fear and faith. When Peter's eyes are fixed on Jesus, he is able to walk on the water. But as soon as he allows fear to take over, when he takes his eyes off Jesus and begins to focus on the wind and the waves, he starts to sink. This is a vivid metaphor for our own lives. When we focus on our problems, when we let the winds of life, the challenges, the fears, the uncertainties consume our thoughts, we begin to sink. But when we keep our eyes on Jesus, when we trust that he is in control, we can walk through the storm with confidence. Fear and faith cannot coexist, because fear draws our attention to our circumstances, while faith draws our attention to God's power and promises. Fear focuses on what could go wrong. Faith focuses on what God has already done and will continue to do. Fear magnifies the problem. Faith magnifies the solution. When we allow fear to take hold, we stop trusting God. We start to rely on our own understanding and abilities, and we forget that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Isaiah 55:8-9. The Apostle Paul understood this tension well. In 2 Timothy 1:7, he writes, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." Paul was encouraging Timothy to recognize that fear is not from God. Fear paralyzes us, keeps us from moving forward, and steals our peace. But the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, gives us power, love, and self-control. This is a spirit that enables us to move forward in faith, even in the face of fear. It's the same spirit that empowered David to face Goliath, the same spirit that enabled the apostles to boldly preach the gospel in the face of persecution, and the same spirit that enables us to step out in faith today, even when everything around us seems uncertain. One of the most insidious ways fear operates is that it often disguises itself as something else. We might call it worry, anxiety, or doubt, but at its root, it is fear. And when we give in to fear, we lose sight of who God is. We forget that he is bigger than our problems, stronger than our enemies, and more faithful than we can comprehend. Fear wants to pull us into a place of self-reliance, to make us think that we can control the outcome if we just try hard enough or plan enough. But faith reminds us that we are not in control, and that's okay, because God is. This is a recurring theme throughout Scripture. In Psalm 56:3, David writes, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." David didn't say, "I will never be afraid." He acknowledged that fear was a part of his experience. But he also knew where to turn when fear crept in. He turned to God. And that's the key. Fear will always try to make an entrance into our hearts. It will show up uninvited, and it will try to convince us that God isn't enough to handle whatever is going on in our lives. But we have a choice. We can either give in to fear, or we can respond with faith. We can either let fear dictate our actions, or we can let faith shape our response. Faith in God isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to trust God in spite of our fears. It's not about denying the reality of the storm, but about acknowledging that God is bigger than the storm. Fear may try to enter our hearts, but we can choose to push it out with faith. We can choose to say, "God, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I trust that you are with me." I trust that you are bigger than this fear. I trust that your plans for me are good, even when I can't see them right now. This is the kind of faith that can move mountains, the kind of faith that enables us to live boldly and fearlessly in a world that is often filled with fear. In the end, fear and faith cannot coexist because they represent two competing forces. Fear focuses on what could go wrong, while faith focuses on what God has already done and will continue to do. Fear tries to control us by making us doubt, but faith releases us to trust God, knowing that He is always in control. The challenge for us is not to eliminate fear altogether, but to make the choice every day to trust God's promises and to walk by faith, not by sight. When we choose faith over fear, we unlock the power of God in our lives. And when fear begins to creep in again, we remind ourselves God is bigger. He is greater. And His faithfulness will always see us through. There are times in life when we feel as though the clock is working against us. We want things to happen now, and we're convinced that the longer we wait, the further we move from what we desire. We live in a culture that values speed, instant results, and convenience. From fast food to on-demand streaming services, we're conditioned to expect things quickly. When we want something, whether it's success, healing, a breakthrough, or even an answer to prayer, we often expect God to move in our lives just as fast as our technology-driven world does. But when we read Scripture, we encounter a different reality. The Bible is filled with stories that speak of waiting, trusting in God's timing, and learning to be patient. Patience, in the biblical sense, is not simply about enduring a difficult situation without complaining. It's about learning to trust God's perfect timing and understanding that He is at work behind the scenes, even when we can't see it. Trusting in God's timing requires us to relinquish our desire for control and let go of our expectations about how things should unfold. It means we trust that God knows what is best for us, even when it doesn't align with our own plans or timelines. Patience, then, is not just about waiting, it's about waiting with faith, with the belief that God is doing something in us and through us during the waiting period. There's a reason why God often works in ways that are different from how we would expect. His understanding of time is far greater than ours. In 2 Peter 3:8, we are reminded that with the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Time for God is not constrained by the same limits that it is for us. His timing is not based on our urgency or our desires, but is always perfectly aligned with His divine will. It's hard for us to grasp this, especially when we are in the middle of a storm, waiting for a breakthrough or looking for a sign that God is doing something in our lives. But trusting in God's timing requires us to believe that God is never early or late. He is always right on time. In the Bible, there are countless examples of men and women who had to wait for God's timing. One of the most well-known stories is that of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, Genesis 15:5. But Abraham and his wife Sarah were old well beyond childbearing age, and they struggled with infertility. Year after year, the promise seemed to grow more impossible. They waited for years with no sign that God's promise was coming to pass. As the years went by, their patience wore thin, and they took matters into their own hands. Sarah, in her desperation, suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar. And so Ishmael was born, but that was not the child through whom God intended to fulfill His promise. God, however, had a plan, and He was working on His timing, not theirs. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, God fulfilled His promise and gave them a son, Isaac. It was a miraculous birth, and it was a testimony to the fact that God's timing is perfect. He could have given Abraham and Sarah a child earlier, but He allowed them to wait so that they would learn to trust Him fully, not just in the good times, but in the difficult ones as well. The waiting period was part of the process of strengthening their faith. In our own lives, waiting on God often feels like an exercise in frustration. We can't see the full picture. We can't understand why things are taking so long, and we begin to question whether God is really at work in our lives. But it's important to remember that God's timing isn't just about the destination, it's about the journey. God doesn't just want to give us what we want, He wants to shape us into the people He created us to be. And part of that shaping happens in the waiting. Waiting on God's timing requires patience, and patience is one of the fruits of the Spirit. In Galatians 5:22-23, Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit, and right alongside love, joy, peace, and kindness is patience. Patience is not a natural characteristic, it's something that the Holy Spirit produces in us as we grow in our relationship with God. When we allow God to work in us during the waiting season, He refines our character. He teaches us to trust in His goodness and sovereignty, even when we don't understand why things are taking so long. Patience is a virtue that grows stronger the more we exercise it, and it becomes easier to wait on God when we remember that He is faithful. But waiting is not always easy. It's hard to trust God's timing when the clock seems to be ticking slower and slower. It's hard to wait when the answer we've been praying for feels like it's never going to come. But that's when faith becomes crucial. Faith is the anchor that holds us steady in the midst of the waiting. It's the belief that God is at work, even when we can't see it, and that He is good, even when life doesn't seem to reflect that. It's trusting that He is doing something behind the scenes, something bigger than what we can understand. And that's where trust comes in, trusting that God's plan is always better than our own. In Psalm 27:14, David encourages us to wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart. And wait for the Lord, notice that he doesn't say, wait for the Lord and complain. He doesn't say, wait for the Lord and grow impatient. He says, wait for the Lord and be strong and take heart. Waiting is not just about sitting idly by while time passes. It's about actively trusting, actively believing that God is going to come through. It's about taking heart, being strengthened in our faith, and knowing that God's timing is always perfect. This is what gives us the strength to endure the waiting period without growing weary or frustrated. Another reason why patience and trust in God's timing are so important is because our understanding of timing is limited. We may think we know what's best, but God sees the bigger picture. We may think that something should happen now, but God knows that waiting is exactly what we need to be prepared for what is ahead. We see only the present moment, but God sees the past, present, and future all at once. He knows what needs to happen in our hearts and lives before we receive what we're asking for. And often He uses the waiting period to prepare us for the blessings He has in store. Waiting is a time of preparation, a time of refining, and a time of strengthening. We also see in Scripture that God's timing is perfect in ways we can't always foresee. In the book of Esther, God's timing is revealed in a powerful way. Esther, a young Jewish woman, finds herself in the palace of the Persian king Xerxes. At a critical moment in Israel's history, the Jewish people are in danger of being wiped out by a decree from the king. Esther has the chance to plead for the lives of her people, but she must do so at great personal risk. She is hesitant, unsure if the time is right. But her uncle Mordecai encourages her with the words, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Esther 4:14. Esther steps out in faith, trusting that God has placed her in this position at the perfect moment in history to save her people. The story of Esther shows us that God's timing is not random, it is intentional. The events of our lives are not coincidental. God places us in certain situations at just the right time, even when we don't fully understand why. In Esther's case, the timing of her position as queen was part of God's larger plan to save His people. She had to trust that God's timing was at work, even though it seemed uncertain. And in the end, God's timing proved to be perfect. We can also look to the example of Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus was often asked by His followers why He didn't act more quickly to heal people or to establish His kingdom. He was often questioned about why things seemed to take so long. But Jesus was always perfectly in tune with the Father's timing. In John 7:6, Jesus says, "My time has not yet come." Jesus wasn't in a hurry because He knew that everything had to unfold according to the Father's plan. Even when He faced suffering and death, He trusted in God's timing. In John 19:30, just before He died on the cross, Jesus said, "It is finished." Jesus knew that he had completed the work God had sent him to do, and he trusted that God's plan was unfolding perfectly, even in the midst of suffering. Trusting in God's timing is a lesson that is learned over time. It's something that requires patience, endurance, and a deep faith that God is in control. And while it's often difficult to wait, we can take comfort in knowing that God's timing is always perfect. He is never too early or too late. He is always right on time. And in the waiting, He is shaping us, preparing us, and strengthening our faith so that we can handle the blessings He has in store. Trusting in God's timing is not just about receiving what we want, but about learning to wait with hope, knowing that God is faithful and that He will never fail to keep His promises. Life has a way of throwing us into storms that shake us to our core, make us question everything we've known, and challenge the very foundation of our faith. These storms come in many forms: the loss of a loved one, financial struggles, unexpected illnesses, personal failures, relational breakdowns, or crises of identity. Some storms come suddenly without warning, while others build slowly over time, intensifying until we find ourselves overwhelmed by the weight of it all. And in those moments, we may feel like we're all alone. The winds howl, the waves crash, and everything we once thought we could count on feels like it's slipping through our fingers. But in the midst of these turbulent seasons, one truth stands firm: God is with us in the storm. When we face challenges that seem insurmountable, it can feel as though we're walking through a season of solitude. We wonder if God has forgotten us, or if He's simply allowing us to go through the storm to teach us a lesson. The truth, however, is that God is never closer to us than when we are in the midst of the storm. It's easy to recognize God's presence when everything is calm, when life is predictable and safe. But when the winds begin to howl and the waters rise, that's when His presence becomes a lifeline and anchor that keeps us from being swept away. One of the most powerful and comforting truths about God is that He is Emmanuel, God with us. From the moment of the incarnation, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, God chose to walk among us, to be with us in the midst of our suffering. He didn't stand at a distance, looking down from on high and watching us struggle. No, He came to us, entered into our pain, and became fully human so that He could understand our struggles. And even after Jesus ascended into heaven, He promised His disciples that He would be with them always, even to the end of the age. Matthew 28:20. The presence of God is not something we need to earn or strive for. It is given to us freely, and it is never withdrawn, no matter the circumstances. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who faced tremendous storms and yet experienced God's faithful presence in those moments. One such story is that of the Israelites in the wilderness. After being delivered from slavery in Egypt, the people of Israel found themselves wandering in the desert for 40 years. They were surrounded by harsh conditions, faced with hunger and thirst, and constantly under threat from surrounding nations. But even in their disobedience and doubt, God was with them. He provided manna from heaven to feed them, water from a rock to quench their thirst, and His presence in the form of a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to guide them. Exodus 13:21-22. Even when they complained, rebelled, and doubted, God was with them, guiding them, protecting them, and providing for them. The Israelites may have felt alone in the wilderness, but God's presence was there all along, even when they couldn't see it. Another powerful example is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 young men who refused to bow to the idols set up by King Nebuchadnezzar. As punishment for their defiance, they were thrown into a blazing furnace, a fiery storm meant to consume them. But as they were thrown into the flames, something miraculous happened. They were not burned. In fact, when the king looked into the furnace, he saw not 3, but 4 figures standing in the fire. One of them, he said, looks like a son of the gods, Daniel 3:25. God was with them in the fire, protecting them and proving that He would not allow His people to be destroyed by the storms of life. The flames did not touch them because God Himself was present in the midst of their trial. In the midst of the storm, God was not distant. He was right there with them, walking through the fire alongside them. In the New Testament, we see another example of God's presence in the storm in the story of Jesus calming the storm. In Mark 4:35-41, we read about a time when Jesus and his disciples were crossing the Sea of Galilee. As they sailed, a fierce storm suddenly arose, and the disciples were terrified. The waves were crashing over the boat, and the wind was howling. In the midst of this chaos, they found Jesus asleep on the cushion, completely unaware of the danger. Panicked, the disciples woke him up, asking, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet. Be still." Immediately, the storm subsided, and there was a great calm. Then he turned to his disciples and asked, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" What's striking about this story is that the disciples were not abandoned in the storm. Jesus was with them the entire time, even though they didn't fully realize it. His presence didn't prevent the storm from happening, but his presence in the storm made all the difference. When the storm became overwhelming, Jesus showed his power over the wind and the waves, calming the chaos and bringing peace. The disciples' fear turned to awe, and they marveled, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." In that moment, they learned that no storm, whether external or internal, could overwhelm them as long as Jesus was with them. His presence in the storm gave them the strength to face it. We often forget that storms are not always external, they can also be internal. Fear, anxiety, doubt, and confusion can be storms that rage within us, and just like the physical storms we face, these inner storms can be terrifying and disorienting. When we feel overwhelmed by our own thoughts and emotions, it's easy to feel like God is far away. But even in these internal storms, God is with us. Psalm 46:1 says, "God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble." The key phrase here is ever-present help. Whether the storm is external or internal, God is present with us. He doesn't stand by and watch us struggle. He is our refuge, our safe place, and our source of strength. The Apostle Paul understood this reality intimately. Throughout his ministry, he faced many storms, shipwrecks, imprisonments, beatings, and countless trials. Yet in the midst of all of these challenges, Paul never wavered in his conviction that God was with him. In 2 Corinthians 4:8-9, he writes, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Paul knew that even when everything seemed to be falling apart, God's presence was with him. He was not abandoned, even when it felt like the world was against him. And it was this confidence in God's presence that gave him the strength to persevere. Jesus' presence in the storm doesn't always mean the storm will be immediately calmed. Sometimes God allows the storm to continue for a season, allowing us to grow in our faith and trust in him. But his presence in the storm means that we are never alone. We are never abandoned to face the storm on our own strength. We are given his strength, his peace, and his assurance that he will see us through. Even when we can't see the way forward, we can trust that God is with us every step of the way. One of the most comforting aspects of God's presence in the storm is that he is not distant or uninvolved. In Matthew 28:20, Jesus promises his followers, "And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." God is with us in the storm, and he will never leave us or forsake us. His presence is not conditional, it is a constant, unwavering promise. Even when we can't feel his presence, even when the storm clouds seem to block out the light, he is there. In those moments, our faith is tested, and we are called to remember his promises and cling to the truth that he is with us. We also have the promise that God will use the storm for his purposes. Romans 8:28 assures us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This doesn't mean that every storm is a direct result of God's will, but it does mean that God can use the storms in our lives to refine us, strengthen us, and draw us closer to him. When we are in the storm, we often don't see the purpose. We don't understand why we must endure the pain or the hardship, but we can trust that God is at work, even in the midst of our suffering. He uses the storms to mold us into the people he wants us to become, to teach us lessons we couldn't learn otherwise, and to deepen our relationship with him. Storms may come, the winds may blow, the waters may rise, but through it all, we can take comfort in knowing that God is with us. His presence is our refuge. His strength is our anchor. His love is our constant. And no matter how fierce the storm may be, we will never face it alone. In the storm, God is with us, and His presence makes all the difference. We don't have to fear the storm because the one who calms the storm is with us every step of the way. We can trust Him, even when the winds are fierce and the waters are high. He is with us, and that is enough.